Franklin Delano Roosevelt grew up at a turbulent time in America's history, in the middle of its great age of industrial expansion at the end of the last century. Immigrant labor came pouring in from Europe to build the railroads, dig the mines, man the factories, and people the cities of the new America. But 80 miles from New York City, in the Hudson Valley countryside, all this could seem very far away. Here the Roosevelt family could live the life of country gentry. Franklin Roosevelt was born here at Hyde Park in 1882 into a background of secure, rather formal comfort. Politics was in the family. His cousin was President Theodore Roosevelt. Young Franklin married the president's niece, Eleanor. No beauty, but a girl of character. She was to be a major influence in Franklin's career, rivaling that of his formidable mother, Sarah. Sarah stood for the old ways, Eleanor for the new world of public service and politics. Franklin went into politics as Under-Secretary of the Navy with Woodrow Wilson, throwing in his lot with the Democrats, the party he was to lead and remodel. Roosevelt busied himself with seeing that the Navy was prepared and his foresight was justified. When in 1917 America entered the war, Roosevelt found himself at the very center of affairs. He supported Wilson's controversial policies at the Paris Peace Conference and agreed with his chief that America must join the newly formed League of Nations. Wilson returned to America to campaign for his beliefs, but the strain ruined his health. In 1920, Roosevelt stood as the Democratic vice presidential candidate committed to Wilson's pro-League policy. But the Americans had had enough of crusades. They did not want to be involved with the old world of Europe. Normalcy was the catchword. The Democrats were out. Roosevelt found himself a private citizen again, practicing law, cultivating political friends, watching his family grow up. He was awaiting his opportunity. But his political future looked uncertain. The American people were determined to enjoy the 20s. Roosevelt's pleasures were of the more traditional, outdoor kind. While America danced, Roosevelt was soon to face his greatest test of character. In the summer after the election, the family went on one of their favorite boating holidays on the cold New England coast. Roosevelt caught a chill. Polio developed. He was never to walk again. The gaiety went on, while Roosevelt fought to regain his health. Roosevelt refused to contemplate the life of a cripple. His mother would have preferred him to retire from public life, but Eleanor urged him not to give up. It was her most important victory. The healing waters of warm springs could give him confidence, but they could not make him walk again. In 1924, he even managed to make a brief return to politics. Roosevelt supported Al Smith for the Democratic candidate in the presidential election. Al Smith did not get the nomination, but Roosevelt was back in politics. The 20s roared on. Stunts, prohibition, gangsterism. In 1928, another election came along. The American people elected the successful engineer and businessman, the Republican Herbert Hoover, the very symbol of the complacency of the age. People still had confidence in American business. The Democrat Roosevelt had his first great political success. He became governor of New York State. From the governor's mansion at Albany, he could begin to project his pleasing image onto the national political scene.
I want to extend to the people of the state of New York my very best wishes for a happy and a prosperous new year.
But it was 1929, and the prosperity that Roosevelt had wished his fellow citizens was not to be theirs for long. The boom had never affected the whole of the economy. The farmers had been outside the mainstream. Now the rest of the prosperity of the decade was suddenly shown to be an illusion, to rest upon a house of cards of financial speculation, much of it dangerous, some of it fraudulent. Wall Street panicked and crashed. The whole economy of the country staggered towards complete collapse. Unemployment figures rose menacingly. Bread lines lengthened. The shanty towns, mockingly named Hoovervilles, ringed the cities. Labor conflicts grew more bitter. The Depression was the Democrats' opportunity. It was also Roosevelt's. His friends continued grooming him for the presidency. In 1932, the Democratic Convention met at Chicago to choose a new presidential candidate. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a strong contender, but there were powerful rivals. Roosevelt got the nomination. In an unprecedented gesture, he flew to Chicago and accepted the nomination in person, refuting the rumors about his poor health. But nomination was only the first step. The election campaign against Hoover was carefully planned and hard fought, with the usual ballyhoo. Hollywood and Will Rogers got into the act.
Come back and see us as a president. I'll do right by you. Because I'm certainly wasting no oratory on a prospect.
The heart of Roosevelt's case was the Republican failure to make headway against the Depression.
The present leadership in Washington stands convicted, not because it did not have the means to plan, but fundamentally because it did not have the will to do. And that is why next week the American people will register their firm conviction that this administration has utterly and entirely failed to meet the great emergency of modern times.
Roosevelt prophesied correctly. The results gave him a decisive victory. He was in. He was president-elect. Four months elapsed between the election and Roosevelt's taking office. Terrible winter months. 13 million unemployed. The whole national banking system, the heart of the nation's economy, was rapidly breaking down. When Roosevelt took up residence at the White House, 2/3 of the nation's banks were closed by official proclamation. More important even than action was the need to restore confidence.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
His inaugural address served warning on those who did not believe that he meant what he said.
In the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency.
Roosevelt's New Deal had begun. New tasks fell to the government, new departments were created, new men were brought in. A bloodless revolution, it seemed. Prohibition vanished unlamented. Regulation of the economy was not enough. Roosevelt saw that people had to be set to work directly. New housing projects, new federal buildings, ambitious road programs. Young men were recruited for healthy open-air work, replanting the country's depleted forests. Roosevelt rejoiced in these things.
It's very good to be here at these Virginia CCC camps. I wish I could see them all over the country. And I hope that all over the country they're in as fine condition as the camps that I've seen today. I wish that I could take a couple of months off from the White House and come down here and live with them, because I know I'd get full of health the way they have. The only difference is that they've put on an average of about 12 pounds apiece since they got here, and I'm trying to take off 12 pounds.
But America was first and foremost an industrial country. The bitterness between capital and labor could not be allowed to hold up recovery. Against growing opposition, Roosevelt sponsored new legislation for the benefit of trade unions.
There are those who fail to read both the signs of the times and American history. They would try to refuse the worker any effective power to bargain collectively, to earn a decent livelihood, and to acquire security. It is those short-sighted ones, not labor, who threaten this country with that class dissension which in other countries has led to dictatorship and the establishment of fear and hatred as the dominant emotions in human life.
The central symbol of the New Deal was power, power in all its forms. For ordinary people, indeed, these were great days, days of hope, but they were not without shadows. The New Deal did not give Americans full social security. It only laid the bare foundations of a welfare state. It by no means cured unemployment. The The economic royalists had recovered quickly from their fright at the time of the Depression and challenged Roosevelt's reforms as unnecessary, as unconstitutional, as communistic. New demagogues sought the leadership of the underprivileged. Roosevelt was wedded to no dogma. He was not too worried about consistency. He chopped and changed his advisors and policies. Every public appearance was a strain and had to be carefully stage managed. He was handicapped by his disability. He could not walk unaided. It was difficult to travel the country and talk directly to as many people as he might have wished. His task was a sedentary one. He was the man in the White House. But science came to his aid. He had at his disposal a new medium hardly exploited before for political purposes, the radio. The Roosevelt of the New Deal period was a presence because he was a voice. The press conferences were important. The fireside chats were more important still. Sometimes Roosevelt would use a fireside chat to enlist public support for one particular feature of his program. At other times, he only sought to create a mood of confidence, to encourage a feeling of moral or even religious dedication.
And it is well for us to remember that this America of ours is the product of no single creed or race or class. We who have faith cannot afford to fall out among ourselves. The very state of the world is a summons to us to stand together. No greater thing could come to our land today than a revival of the spirit of religion, a revival that could sweep through the homes of the nation and stir the hopes and the hearts of men and women of all faiths to a reassertion of their belief in God and their dedication to His will for themselves and for their world.
Roosevelt's own religious faith was a simple one, the faith of his period and of his family. The family meant much to him. The public-spirited Eleanor, his mother, children, grandchildren. As a president, he had some failings, for he was not a born administrator. Documents and files meant little. He worked by making use of other men's brains, playing one off against the other, giving no one his full confidence. Even on holiday, politics were not forgotten. He was not embittered by his physical condition and never abandoned his early love of the sea and the sports connected with the sea, sailing and fishing in gay parties. Back from holiday, he could draw a fisherman's moral.
I'm very glad to see you all, and it's mighty good of you to come down here. I can't be truthful and say that I'm glad to get back. I'm awfully sorry to get back. But while I've been having a wonderful time, I gather also that both houses of Congress have been having a wonderful time in my absence. And, well, anyway, I wish you'd had the chance that I had to get away for 2 weeks, because I did have a wonderful holiday. And I've come back with all sorts of new lessons, which I learned from barracuda and sharks. I'm a tough guy.
He needed to be tough. There were other kinds of shocks. In Washington, the Supreme Court had ruled some of Roosevelt's legislation unconstitutional. He had run into other difficulties. Some of his early advisors had left him. Some old friends had become bitter critics. But the critics overlooked the fact that Roosevelt was more than a gentleman with a winning smile. He was a tough politician out to keep power.
You and I know that the values of property of all kinds, farms, houses, automobiles, securities, and every other kind of property have increased so greatly since 1933 that today we're once more in the black. We were insolvent. Today we're solvent.
After 4 years of Roosevelt's presidency, the old order got another chance in a new election. The Republicans had found a new standard-bearer in Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas. There was a hard-fought campaign.
People of America. People of America have no quarrel with business. They insist only that the power of concentrated wealth shall not be abused.
Roosevelt won in a landslide. The New Deal had been vindicated, if not in the minds of intellectuals, then in the hearts of the people. His second inaugural address was again a call to action.
But here is the challenge to our democracy. I see millions lacking the means to buy the products of farm and factory, and by their poverty denying work and productiveness to many other millions. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. In taking again the oath of office as President of the United States, I assume the solemn obligation of leading the American people forward along the road over which they have chosen to advance.
But there was to be no advance. The New Deal was over. External events were catching up with America. In Germany, Hitler, the Nazis. America was to find that she could not contract out of history. Mussolini made war in Africa. There was war in the Far East. Civil war in Spain. During these years, what did Roosevelt do? He made speech after speech, each suggesting that America might need to take action, but each unclear as to what action should be taken. Was Roosevelt too cautious, too slow in reacting to the external danger, too respectful of the ingrained isolationism of Americans? Or was he playing for time? Did he know in his heart that war was certain, that America could not stay out? As the clouds darkened, his warnings became sharper.
It is my determination to adopt every practicable measure to avoid involvement in war. War is a contagion, whether it be declared or undeclared. It can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scene of hostilities. Yes, we are determined to keep out of war, yet we cannot insure ourselves against the disastrous effects of war and the dangers of involvement. America hates war. America hopes for peace. Therefore, America actively engages in the search for peace.
But what did the search for peace mean? More speeches, more conferences, more no-war pledges, more scraps of paper? The world was not given time to find out. Hitler invaded Poland. France and Britain declared war on Germany. Poland fell. While Europe got into battle array, things still seem almost normal in America.
These perilous days demand cooperation between us, without a trace of partisanship. Our acts must be guided by one single hard-headed thought: keeping America out of this war.
Easier said than done. Hitler struck again, and France fell to the Nazis. Now Roosevelt knew that the pace of help would have to be speeded up. American industry must produce war supplies in far greater quantities. If all should fail, America itself must be prepared for war. As in other countries, young men must register for military service.
To the 16 million young men who register today, I say that democracy is your cause, the cause of youth.
But still there were limits on what could be done. Roosevelt was coming to the end of his second term of office, and no president had ever served for a third term. Roosevelt felt that he had no alternative, though many would regard this merely as proof of his inordinate ambition. But while he could be nominated, it was not certain that he could win. He had to take on an energetic newcomer, Republican Wendell Willkie. Both candidates promised to keep the country out of the war. The campaign was a bitter one. Roosevelt's victory was not as sweeping as 4 years earlier, but he had won. He was still safely in command. There was no more need to temporize. He could call on Americans for greater efforts.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas, and they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun loaded with explosive bullets, economic as well as military. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
By now, America was virtually a non-belligerent ally of the forces still fighting Hitlerism. By helping Britain, Americans were drawn into the Battle of the Atlantic. Hitler's attack on Russia altered the whole face of the conflict. If Russia could hold, the war might be won. It was time for Roosevelt to step onto a wider stage. In August 1941, at a secret rendezvous off the foggy coast of Newfoundland, Roosevelt, the head of a nation still nominally at peace, met Winston Churchill, Britain's war leader, at the summit of his power. In the Atlantic Charter, they agreed on guiding principles for world peace. Roosevelt and Churchill appreciated and liked one another. But were they ever as close as they both believed? Churchill stood for the traditional Britain in all its imperial glory. Roosevelt cherished a utopian dream of a world without empires. Each suspected the other's motives, not without reason. Roosevelt returned to America to face Pearl Harbor.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Pearl Harbor made it possible for Roosevelt to take a united nation into the war. What is a reforming leader to do when war comes and finds him still at the helm? The Constitution made the President Commander-in-Chief. Roosevelt did not interfere with his professional advisors in matters of strategy. He was still, first and foremost, the politician, and there were aspects of the war where a politician's arts were called for. He had to make the fighting men and their families feel the nation appreciated their sacrifices. It was important to see that war production went at full blast. The president must exhort, encourage, warn, and where necessary, act in order to see that no strikes or other disputes held up the vital supplies from America's shipyards and factories. Roosevelt's old enemies, the industrial giants, had to play their part. The political arts that had won him power in his own country were now also lavished on men of a very different breed. Roosevelt became the tireless traveller in search of agreement and conciliation. The record of his presidency during these years is studied with the names of international conferences: Quebec, Casablanca, Malta, Tehran, Cairo. Now with Churchill and Mackenzie King of Canada, now trying to reconcile the touchy leaders of resurgent France, now encouraging Chiang Kai-shek to devote more energy to the war against Japan. But above all, his efforts were directed to trying to understand the Russians and to get on terms with Stalin. If Stalin's confidence could be gained, if he could be persuaded that the Americans were not like the imperialist British, but genuine in their devotion to democracy, surely it would be possible to get a peace that all men of goodwill could accept. But Stalin was not a man of goodwill. At home, Roosevelt had another election to fight. Not even a war could quell the party ardor of Americans. The Republicans had found a fourth champion, Thomas Dewey. In a sharp campaign, they used every weapon that came to hand, but they were no match for the Roosevelt skill and charm.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Fala. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family don't resent attacks, but Fala does resent it. You know, Fala's Scotch. And being a Scottie, as soon as he learned that the Republican fiction writers in Congress and out had concocted a story that I'd left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. I think I have a right to resent, to object to libelous statements about my dog.
For the last time, the Roosevelt magic worked. He was re-elected. At the beginning of his fourth term, he was a tired man. The strain of office was having its effect. In February 1945, at Yalta, Roosevelt met Churchill and Stalin for the last time. Many lies have been circulated about this conference by Roosevelt's enemies. He did not give in to the Russians out of weakness or sickness. The military balance was shaping the new Europe, not diplomacy. Roosevelt was resolved to try what trust would do. It was a failure, but a noble one. Roosevelt returned to America a very sick man indeed. Congress was waiting to hear his report.
Vice President,
Speaker, members of the Congress, I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say, but I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs, and also because of the fact that I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip.
The Allies at Yalta had two main objects: to plan the final destruction of the Nazi Reich and to lay the foundation of an enduring peace. Above Roosevelt's patent fatigue, there was a note of optimism.
And I am confident that the Congress and the American people will accept the results of this conference as the beginnings of a permanent structure of peace, upon which we can begin to build, under God, that better world in which our children and grandchildren, yours and mine, the children and grandchildren of the whole world, must live and can live.
This was his last speech. Shortly afterwards, on April the 12th, 1945, he died at Warm Springs. The world mourned for Roosevelt on the very eve of the Allied victory. He had restored the confidence of the Americans in their own innate capacities. He had taught them to seek solutions for the new problems of the 20th century in ways compatible with their democratic heritage. Roosevelt was not an original thinker, but he had the gift of expressing man's dearest hopes in accents that quickened the pulse and that still move the hearer.
We look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear.